on the rubble of her home. She cries out for her parents, but the voices are gone. She cannot understand. She's confused. She's alone. There is blood on her hands, but it's not her fault. Not her fight, not her war. She's too young to give up, but it's not her fault.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Remember Palestine with me, Lauren Booth. Since Israel's 23-day assault on the civilian population of the Gaza Strip 3 years ago, the humanitarian crisis for Palestinians has only worsened. In today's programme, we will be looking at the reasons behind the UN's Relief and Works Agency emergency appeal for $300 million. Why is the money needed and where does it go? I'll be talking to UNRWA's spokesman later on. Meanwhile, earlier this week, in just 48 hours, Palestinians across their territories have endured 2 airstrikes, 4 acts of economic sabotage, and 103 restrictions of movement, and more. I'll be talking to an activist in Gaza who was under attack and the head of Arab Media Watch to discuss why it's only here on Press TV you hear these figures. Now, a report from the West Bank from our correspondent, Ibrahim Husseini.
Gaza's ongoing blockade, settler violence and settlement expansion in the West Bank has severely impacted the living conditions of Palestinians there. Conditions which led UNRWA to launch an emergency appeal worth more than $300 million to assist Palestinians in dealing with the effects of the Israeli occupation. In 2011, home demolitions alone accounted for 1,100 displaced Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Al-Quds, and much of the West Bank. The crisis is ongoing, and this is what UNRWA's appeal is all about, not just for long-time refugees, but also for newly displaced Palestinians as a result of home demolitions, occurring now almost on a daily basis. Just few kilometers northeast of the old city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, sits Abdullah Sulaiman, a leader of a small community of Jahalin Bedouins living on the eastern edge of the suburb of Anata. Sulaiman's small community of 300 had a brush with the Israeli bulldozers 2 nights ago. 7 structures that served as homes were demolished.
They came
at 11 at night, gave us 5 minutes to leave our homes, and then they demolished it. We spent the night in the open. UNRWA helps us, and we thank them.
In Bethlehem's Dheshe refugee camp, UNRWA's work seemed no less urgent. Apart from providing medical services and education, the agency supports various community centers. Any hint of cutting or reducing UNRWA's services is immediately denounced by the refugees.
We provide services to people with special needs by providing hearing aids, walking aids. We ask countries of the world to support UNRWA.
This is a women's community centre, the only one in the area. We have a programme that empowers women to help them earn a living. It's difficult to go on without the agency's support.
UNRWA has over 2 million registered refugees in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Vulnerability to food insecurity is put at 60% in the Gaza Strip and at 40% in the West Bank. But to Palestinian refugees, UNRWA is not just an agency that provides basic needs. It has a much deeper significance. For refugees, the ultimate goal is the return to their lands, which they lost to Israel in 1948 and in subsequent wars. Any talk to end UNRWA's mission without this solution is dismissed by Palestinian refugees. Reporting for Remember Palestine, Ibrahim Husseini, East Jerusalem, Al-Quds.
Well, joining me now down the line from Al-Quds, Jerusalem, to discuss the latest UNRWA appeal is their spokesman, Chris Gunness. Chris, thanks for coming on RP again. We saw in our report that a Bedouin community has just had their tent village demolished. Have you been visiting those in demolished homes during your time in Al-Quds?
Absolutely, because about half of the Bedouin community and a bit more in Area C are actually UNRWA refugees. So, of course, we've not just been visiting them, we've not just been delivering services, we've been doing a great deal of advocacy on their behalf. There's a campaign called Don't Demolish My Future on www.unrwa.org, where we invite people to use their Facebook status to support this campaign. We've also been raising this in our private advocacy with government ministers, of course, government ministers from the West who are visiting and talking to the Israeli Defense Establishment, for example, including the defense minister. So both behind the scenes and in public, we've been advocating, and we've also been assisting these communities. Let's make one thing clear. What we are seeing potentially are mass forcible transfers. These are grave breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention for which there has to be accountability. So, yes, we're very concerned about it. We're helping them with humanitarian support, and we're also helping them with advocacy, which I think is just as important in many ways.
Chris, I can actually hear the fury in your voice, and I've never heard you more angry. Your agency, UNRWA, now needs $300 million just to keep up with a backlog of work in Gaza and across the territories. How are you surviving at UNRWA? How is UNRWA able to keep up with the forced transfers?
The answer is very, very badly. Our emergency appeal that you refer to is not just for the West Bank, which is actually a quarter of the emergency appeal. Between 75 and 80% of the rest of it is for Gaza. And the reason why we have to make such a huge appeal for Gaza is that there is a collective punishment going on. UNRWA, sadly, is asking its donors to mitigate the impact of collective punishment, of closure and of occupation in the West Bank. Would it not be better, I ask, to get those donors, instead of giving us millions and millions each year for emergency work, wouldn't it be better to get rid of the root causes, to apply the appropriate pressures, to get rid of the collective punishment, to get rid of the blockade, and to get rid of the occupation? Then we wouldn't need all this emergency work. You know, if Gaza could export, the aid dependency would decline, would diminish. People of Gaza are extremely entrepreneurial. They know how to survive economically, they know how to thrive economically. But because they can barely export a thing, the Israelis have just totally demolished the largest crossing point, an industrial scale crossing point that was there precisely to export hundreds of trucks of export every day. That's now been demolished. So the prospects of Gaza being able to export, of aid dependency decreasing, has now effectively been demolished.
Chris,
so, I again ask, is it not better for our donors to deal with those root causes rather than to get UNRWA to mitigate the impact of these breaches of international law?
Chris, that's a great roundup. I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes, if I may. Please stay on the line. I'm joined now by the director and founder of Arab Media Watch, Sharif Nashashibi, to discuss more on the funding and the lack of coverage of Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people in the mainstream media. Welcome, Sharif. Hi. We heard a very angry, very outspoken UNRWA spokesman there, Chris Gunness, outlining forcible transfer. Now, as you founded Arab Media Watch, to watch the narratives that come up in the media, and you must have focused a lot on the Israel-Palestine question. Yeah. What does any of this surprise you, first of all, because you worked in Ramallah? And secondly, what changes have you seen, if any, in the media coverage coming out from the occupied territories to the wider world?
Well, the narrative isn't really there in the media coverage. Unless I had looked on the UNRWA website, I would have had no idea about this emergency appeal because the media haven't covered it. This hasn't changed. There are several reasons for this lack of coverage. One is that there is an agenda among certain sections in the media not to highlight these injustices. Another thing is the issue of access, that the media, for the most part, are not based in the occupied territories, they're based in Israel. So they don't see firsthand. They don't live in the arena that they're covering. So they don't give it enough coverage. And another reason, unfortunately, is because these injustices have gone on for such a long time, they cease to be news. They're not new, they're not newsworthy anymore.
And look, to be fair, when we talk about a charitable appeal, is it really the Guardian's job, the BBC's job, to give coverage to appeal? What's another charity appeal?
Well, particularly because these are annual appeals. There's nothing new about them. So unfortunately, I think I think Israel has learned very well that if you continue an injustice for long enough, people won't cover it anymore because it's not new, and this is an annual appeal.
However, at the same time, hearing Chris there use the phrase collective punishment, now that's incredibly powerful, and I think that 2 years ago that would have got some coverage in itself, saying that the Gazan people, the Palestinian people, are collectively punished by Israel. There would have been an outcry. Now there's silence. What do you read into that?
I think what I've noticed is there is a concerted attempt by those in the media that are sympathetic to Israel to actually paint UNRWA as a kind of wing of, let's say, the Palestinian Authority or something, of being kind of inherently biased towards the Palestinians and anti-Israel, simply because they're highlighting this injustice.
Yeah.
That they try just as hard to paint UNRWA in a bad light as they do the Palestinians. And I think that there's this concerted attempt to discredit UNRWA because they highlight these injustices. And I think this is not just the funding issue that's a problem for UNRWA, but the issue of image, that people are trying to tarnish the image for UNRWA simply for speaking out against these injustices.
Yeah, Chris, I want to bring you back into this discussion. UNRWA painted as inherently biased. Does this stop your work? Are you angry? Is there anything you want to say to the British media who are not taking your message to the British public, for example?
First of all, can I congratulate my fellow discussant on what I think is an extremely insightful and very eloquent summation of the problem. I think that UNRWA, which is a neutral humanitarian UN organization, is much misunderstood. As head of communications for this organization, of course I bear some responsibility for that. But as your guest also said, there is a huge amount of narrative muddlings, shall we say, that's going on around UNRWA. To begin with, people on the Palestinian side think that UNRWA has a political mandate to somehow implement the right of return, somehow to lead an army of Palestinians back into sort of historic Palestine. We don't have a mandate to do that. We have a mandate to do relief and social services pending a just and durable solution. So we advocate for a just and durable solution, but it's the quartet and Israel and the Palestinians and the PA and the parties that have to produce a resolution of the refugee crisis. So that's one major misunderstanding on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, Israeli media, and I think to some extent in the Western media, there is sometimes a deliberate, sometimes an unfortunately ignorant tendency to deliberately misunderstand what UNRWA is about. And there is, I think, a tendency to play into this narrative which says basically they might be UN, but they employ 30,000 refugees. Therefore, they are biased. Therefore, they are all terrorists, racial stereotype, close brackets. They are people who will naturally be inherently anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. Again, a gross intellectual dishonesty and misunderstanding. But all of these are thrown at us because of politically motivated attempts to push an argument which basically says, get rid of UNRWA and you'll get rid of the Palestine refugees that are a big problem for Israel. Not true. If you got rid of UNRWA, these are human beings with rights. And like all refugees, they have three choices. They have the right to stay where they are, known as local integration, go to some third country repatriation, or repatriation, i.e. the right to go home. Now, I'm not saying they must do this or they must do that, but all of those choices must be respected. The refugees must have the right to make free and informed choices about their own futures. That's the
Thank
case
you, Chris. Let me
with
just
all
bring in
refugees
Sharif.
Anywhere in the world.
I'll just bring Sharif back in. So on the ground, some resistance, I think, in Palestine to UNRWA's work because they haven't met unreal expectations. Is that something you've experienced in the West Bank?
I mean, there is anger. I don't think it's directed specifically at UNRWA. There's anger that UNRWA's efforts haven't borne fruit. But I don't think Palestinians blame UNRWA. I mean, I think there is a recognition that UNRWA faces incredible obstacles and odds to achieving their work. So I think there's